Welcome, everyone, to the onpoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, the Ontario Energy Board wants you to pay more for your natural gas. Energy Minister Todd Smith disagrees. Guess who won this fight?
We're hearing rumors of a new omnibus bill that's headed to Queen's Park.
And the Premier is dropping hints about a huge infrastructure project, perhaps the biggest in the world. What's that all about?
It's Friday, February 16th, 2024. So let's get to it.
Now, JMM, this is the part of the podcast where you and I usually off the top just do a little bit of small talk, catch up on a couple of things from the past week. But given that we sort of already just did that, shall we just dive in?
A logical conclusion, Mr. Spock.
Yeah, that's another thing. We both like Star Trek a lot, so apologies in advance for the occasional reference. Before we get to our
we did call it a nerdy podcast.
We did.
So
well, you did.
What
you
it
did.
says on the tin.
Live long and prosper, my friend. Live long and prosper. Now, before we get to our three issues, we always like to dive into the mailbag. Gives you a chance to give us some feedback, and you can do that by emailing us at onpolitics@tvo.org. So what have we got in the mailbag this week?
This comes from Febran Budiman from Milton, Ontario, who asks, one comment and one question for the On Poly podcast. Under the new federal redistricting, there will be 2 Milton ridings. There's currently just one. So Parm Gill, who we've talked about, has resigned from provincial politics. He's going to run in one of the 2 ridings should the federal election happen after April this year. But the other one is open for now. On a related topic, a question. Will there be a redistricting in Ontario? The current map is mostly based on federal redistricting in effect since 2013. Now that there is a new federal map, when will Ontario adjust theirs?
Okay, some good questions there. Let's do a little background and catch everybody up here. A couple of weeks ago, Progressive Conservative MPP Parm Gill resigned his position as the Minister of Red Tape Reduction to run federally for Pierre Poilievre's Conservative Party of Canada. Since he was representing Milton in the Ontario legislature, it stands to reason that Mr. Gill will be running in one of those 2 federal ridings that you just referenced, Burlington-Milton West or Georgetown-Milton East. And one of those ridings will likely have Liberal MP and former Olympian Adam Van Koeverden as the competition, since he is the current MP for the riding of Milton federally, whereas the other riding will presumably have just all newcomers with no former sitting member. So, does Parm Gill run against Van Koeverden, who had more than 50% of the vote last time, or does he take a shot at the new riding? That is what he's got to figure out between now and the next election.
Yes, and this is one of those cases where it'll be revealing what the outcome is, what Parm Gill chooses. But if he does choose to run against Van Koeverden, I mean, he, as you say, he won quite handily last time, but it's a very different political environment than it was in 2021.
That would be the gutsier play, wouldn't it, to go against the former sitting member?
Right, and I mean, he could probably make himself a lot of fans in the current federal Conservative Party if he ended up defeating Van Koeverden. I know that a lot of people... I mean, there's always acrimony between political parties. I think a lot of Conservatives would particularly enjoy defeating Van Koeverden, but that's just sort of general political acrimony.
Yeah, who defeated Lisa Raitt the previous election? She was very popular.
Yes. Lisa Raitt, of course, has ruled out running for federal or provincial politics at the moment. But on the second question, the federal redistricting, or rather, I should say the provincial redistricting one, this is something we know a little bit about. Historically, Ontario has followed the federal redistricting ever since 1999, when Mike Harris introduced and passed the Fewer Politicians Act, which did what it said in the title. It shrank the number of MPPs at Queen's Park.
You know who the biggest casualty of that act was?
Please do tell the audience. This is fun.
Oh, so you know, right?
Well, you're talking about the Premier's father.
Exactly.
Yes.
Doug Ford's father, whose name was also Doug Ford. When they went to Fewer Politicians, he lost his job.
Yeah. But when the Liberals came into power in 2003, they modified the plan slightly so that Ontario retains all of its northern seats. Those don't change no matter what happens federally. It seems safe to say that the current government is going to probably follow the same script. When I asked the Premier's office about this a few months back, about whether they intended to preserve the northern ridings, they didn't want to commit to anything. They didn't give a detailed answer because this is legislation that has not been introduced or passed by the House yet, but they did say that they always intend to protect the voice of Northern Ontario at the legislature. So they have time to do this. It doesn't happen automatically. They do have to introduce legislation to change the makeup of Queen's Park, but they can do that at any time before 2026. While we're talking about Parm Gill, though, I mean, he may have started a trend. There could be more Ontario MPPs who are also looking for the exits and may choose to jump to federal politics. There's a bunch of different reasons why an MPP might do that. That's a more prominent job. And as you and I have talked about before on this podcast, MPs and city councillors, but not MPPs, have pensions. And there are totally normal household finance reasons why a person might seek a political career at a different level.
Federal MPs are paid much more than provincial MPs, and there is a pension federally, and there's no pension provincially. Thank Mike Harris for that. He got rid of the MPP's pension back in the 1990s. So there.
Mike Harris comes up a lot.
He does, doesn't he?
I believe you got a show about that.
That may very well be the case. Stay tuned to other episodes of the agenda for that.
Again, if you'd like to ask about the content on the show, please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org. Make sure to include your first name, last name, and the city you live in. Now, on to issue 1.
Late last year, Ontario's Energy Minister Todd Smith said he would be introducing legislation to reverse a decision that the Ontario Energy Board had made on new homes and how they are heated. JMM, pick up the story if you would.
Really bringing the audience in on the sexiest possible topic of energy regulation. It is always odd when the government announces something, when they send out a press release very late in December, as this was. I was actually on vacation and I checked my inbox and there's this news release, and that almost never happens. The government was responding to a ruling from the Ontario Energy Board that said that Enbridge, the gas utility in the province of Ontario, had to pay upfront for new homes connected to the gas grid instead of amortizing the cost over decades, which is the normal practice, or has been the normal practice so far. The OEB's decision was based on broadly the topic of the energy transition, as they call it, right? Homes using more electricity to power their cars and heat their homes instead of natural gas. The OEB basically said, we don't know how much longer this gas infrastructure is going to be useful for, so if we're going to build more of it, let's pay for it up front. In their decision, the OEB estimated that the cost would be something like $4,400 per new home. That didn't sit well with the government. Energy Minister Todd Smith announced that he will be introducing legislation basically as soon as the legislature returns later this month to reverse this decision, specifically on the grounds that it will make new homes more expensive.
Now, Minister Smith said that reversing this decision would help keep shovels in the ground for home development, which of course this government is very hot on. But is whether you use a gas furnace or a heat pump really holding things up?
This is the fair question, right? There is a trend towards more electrification in homes. I mean, it's a bit of like everything old is new again, right? In the 50s and 60s, you saw campaigns for the all-electric home. And now we're seeing a return to that, this time with things like heat pumps and electric cars. Ontario, relative to other provinces, could be, I think, fairly said to be lagging behind a bit out of however many millions of homes we have in this province. Only about 400,000 currently use heat pumps. Those numbers are substantially higher in some other provinces. That said, incentivizing developers to choose heat pumps for new builds instead of using gas furnaces traditionally could be a way to build in more efficiency in the new homes that we do build. The Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, a position that has since been folded into the Auditor General's office, had criticized some of the current policies which encourage new natural gas infrastructure, even in cases where heat pumps would be more affordable. The cost of heat pumps, though, is still high. Some consumers are wary of them and whether they will work in deep cold weather. Say this for natural gas, but a hot flame is pretty low tech and pretty reliable. You have to do things like upgrade the electrical system in your house sometimes. So there are reservations about moving to heat pumps for some people.
So the situation of Energy Minister Todd Smith introducing legislation to rebuke a decision made by the Ontario Energy Board, how big a deal is that?
It's not a small deal, certainly. I did speak with some environmental advocates who said, quite aside from the substance of the decision, they really didn't like the sight of what is supposed to be a professional arm's length regulator being overruled by the provincial government, basically on broadly speaking, they're being overruled by the political side of the government, and that was concerning. It's also clearly a case where the government is picking a side, right? They're picking natural gas over a cleaner energy source. It could, in theory, be reversed by another government in time, after the next election. This is something I wrote for TVO.org. This is not a huge decision in terms of its direct stakes, right? We're talking about a few thousand more homes that will be built between now and the next election that will be connected to the gas grid. That's out of an installed base of about 4 million homes between Ontario and Quebec. So it's not the end of the world, and we shouldn't catastrophize it or over dramatize it.
But it will pollute more.
Sorry?
It will pollute more.
But it will pollute more, and it'll add to the margins, and the margins can matter. And the broader issue here is about the sustainability of our energy system overall, and how quickly or not so quickly we are transitioning to cleaner systems.
Okay, with that, on to issue 2. Now, sticking with housing, there's some reporting from the investigative online magazine The Narwhal that Ontario may be looking to expand its power to expropriate land. The so-called Get It Done Act could be introduced when the legislature returns. The Get It Done Act. I wonder where they got that line from.
I was going to say, this bill has not been presented to the legislature. You and I have not seen the text. We are going off of the Narwhal's reporting. But based on the title alone, I find this a very credible report.
It sounds like it. So what's it all about?
So this is, again, from the Narwhal's reporting, based on the idea that in order to get more housing built, we need to get more infrastructure built, right? You plug homes into things like roads and wires and pipes, and that's how we get homes built. And one of the ways that you do that, particularly for things like highways, is you expropriate the land, right? If you need to build a very big, long highway, you don't go and negotiate with every single landowner on that route. The government just says, hi, we're taking your land, here's some money. Now, there's a process to do that legally and fairly, and traditionally the government has to meet a test of it's called a hearing of necessity. The government has already, with some of its transit projects, dramatically scaled back that process and made it much easier to prove necessity for expropriation. They could now be doing something like that for new highway projects, including for the more controversial one, like the Highway 413 in the Western GTA.
Well, yeah. In fact, in a recent episode, we did mention that, I think we were talking about the Greenbelt, actually, and we said that, good process, as boring as that sounds, actually is really important when it comes to good governance. There are supposed to be checks and balances in place that prevent shenanigans from happening. Clearly, that did not appear to be the case in the Greenbelt story. But the theory is good process leads to good governance, leads to good outcomes, and that's what we want at the end of the day. So what is it about the current process that the current premier finds either too slow or too ineffective or whatever?
Well, I mentioned those hearings of necessity. That is one part of the process that they, as I said, they've already sped up for transit projects. And there are other steps as well, like, these kinds of large projects involve environmental assessments. There's obviously been some friction between the federal and provincial governments over whether the 413 would require a federal impact assessment.
Province sure hopes not.
Well, exactly. The province also has to work with other expropriating and approval authorities, so that could be municipalities, they're all well-intentioned processes. They all were, governments don't create hurdles for no reason. They were all justified when we started doing these things, in some cases decades ago. The government is, I think, looking at these things with a let's call it a fresher eye and saying, actually, this process that we implemented to keep a highway from getting bulldozed through somebody's neighborhood 50 years ago in that era of highway building, it doesn't need to pass the same test as the highways we're building today. Now, of course, the government's critics would say, actually, yes, we still need to pass those tests as well. So that's part of the argument.
We actually did go through all this 50 years ago. It was called the Spadina Expressway, and a guy named Bill Davis stopped it before it could, in my view, rip its way right through a bunch of neighborhoods like Forest Hill and the Annex and go all the way down to the waterfront. And 50 years later, we're still arguing about whether that was the right decision. I think it was. Anything else about this story we should know?
There are, again, the Narwhal reports that we could see changes to urban boundaries. Now, this has been sort of a flip-flop and now potentially a re-flip. The government last year expanded a bunch of urban boundaries throughout the province, allowing these cities to open up new lands for development, and in some cases forcing them against their clearly expressed opinions to expand their urban boundaries. Then late last year, the government reversed that decision, and now they are potentially bringing those urban boundary expansions back. Now, let's get nerdy
for a change.
For a change, the difference seems to be that whereas they previously used the minister's power, to executively expand the urban boundaries, they would now do that with legislation. There's a bunch of reasons why you might do that. One is that you can, with legislation, also say things like, not only are we expanding urban boundaries, but all of the avenues that you normally have to appeal something like that don't apply. The government can, using the legislature, short-circuit a lot of those things. We don't know that that's what they are going to do or why they are going to do that. As we say, we haven't seen the bill yet, but that's one reason why you might use the legislature instead of using the powers that the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, in this case, Paul Calandra, already has. The government is also responding to concerns from Indigenous community about proposed changes. The Chiefs of Ontario and First Nations strongly opposed Bill 23. This was introduced shortly after the last election. It is called the More Homes Built Faster Act. It does not actually seem to have gotten more homes built faster yet. We're still working on that here in Ontario.
Kind of a problem if that's what the act's called.
Sorry?
It's kind of a problem if that's what the act is called.
Yeah, exactly. So a number of Indigenous communities had hoped for more consultation, more engagement over potential environmental harms from Bill 23. There was another element that the Narwhal reported on that caught my eye, so-called special building zones, where the province might take over local planning directly for priority projects. You could guess at a number of different ways they might use that. One thing we have talked about on the podcast before is Ontario Place, where the province has made it very clear that they are just going to go ahead with that and their redevelopment of that land. And part of the New Deal between Ontario and Toronto that was announced late last year is basically that Mayor Olivia Chow is sort of stepping back and saying, not my problem anymore.
It's called Ontario Place, not Toronto Place.
Exactly.
That was her line.
So that will be something I will be looking at very, very closely when and if we see a bill introduced like this. As we say, this is all still in flux. We haven't seen a bill. We haven't seen the text of legislation. We will have to see the entirety of the bill before we can really pick it apart and judge it for our listeners.
So stay tuned.
Absolutely.
And with that, on to issue 3. Well, there was a moment at a press conference a few weeks back that has been on your mind, JMM. The Premier was in Toronto delivering some remarks about expanding roads and highways, and he said this.
That's just as we speak now, the $28 billion. We have a few other ideas up our sleeves that are going to really going to be incredible. We're thinking of a project that's going to be one of the largest projects in the world, but stay tuned for that one.
That is a heck of a hint to drop. What do you think he's hinting at?
I mean, we don't know. I asked the Premier's office if they would care to elaborate, and as we record this, they have not responded. There's a few things, though. Like, there's a few possibilities, a few broad categories. Let me put it that way. He was speaking at the Ontario Road Builders Association annual meeting, so that's like one clue. Maybe this is a highway project, right? Ontario has some very large road projects underway already. My mind goes to the Gordie Howe Bridge down by Windsor, Detroit. Now, that's a federal project, though there are substantial provincial contributions to that.
Now, can I just jump in?
Yeah.
I know you're not a sports fan, but do you know who Gordie Howe was?
He was a hockey player, correct?
He was a hockey player? Before Wayne Gretzky, he was absolutely the greatest of all time.
Well,
so just FYI.
Our new audience members are going to have to learn that I'm absolutely hopeless with sports references.
This is why I raised it. And of course, to me, this was the best thing Stephen Harper ever did, was create this Gordie Howe Bridge, because it linked Detroit, where Gordie Howe played for almost all of his career, with Canada, where he's from. So it was a beautiful thing.
So that is a...
Boy, did I get us off the path there. But anyway, get us back on the path.
So that is one example of a major infrastructure project, but it's already underway. So I don't think that's what the Premier is talking about. One thing that occurred to me, though, we've talked about transit already in this episode of the podcast. Back in 2022, the Ministry of Transportation published what they called the long-term transportation plan that included a sort of like wish list for all of the major projects the government was considering out until about 2050 or so. And that included some very big ideas that they said at the time they were in the midst of doing, substantial planning work for. One included something they billed as the Ontario Line Loop Extension, which if our viewers and listeners know, the rough plan for the Ontario line is to start at what is currently still the Ontario Science Centre, go south down to sort of downtown Toronto, and then turn west. The idea of this loop extension would be to keep going west until you hit about Kipling, then go north to Pearson, and then come back east, and then go all the way across the top of the city and be this massive...
Circular.
Yes, exactly. A loop extension. Now, I don't know that that's what the Premier was referring to. Again, the Premier's office did not answer my questions. But it's the kind of idea, it's the scale that would be one of the biggest projects in the world as the Premier billed it. It would be truly, truly massive. And like, that's in the context of a transportation building spree that this government is on that is already quite large.
And not only that, I mean, that would presumably take decades to complete. I mean, that's something that our kids might not... Our kids might be grandparents before that thing were ever done.
I think it's fair to say that if the Premier announces this, he will not be the one to get it done.
Well, if you're right, this takes... Stay tuned to a new level. The Ontario line itself has barely begun construction. The Premier's already previewing an extension that won't start construction for years or even decades. Is that right?
Well, if I'm right, then yes, that would be basically the sum of it. But, we could also, it's the onpoli, the politics podcast, so I will make a political point here. We know that the Progressive Conservative government and the PC party have done pretty well by emphasizing to voters their desire to build and keep building. And so let's go over that route one more time, right? It would almost perfectly go through ridings that are currently held by the PC party.
Oh, you're so cynical.
Oh, it's a disease. I apologize already. Now, it might be a perfectly defensible transit project. And in fact, I think it could very well be. I think, and I'm biased towards spending money on public transit anyway. But the political map and the transit planning map sometimes align in funny ways, and that is something I would say is not true only about this government.
Well, since you mention it, I well remember Bob Rae's government back in the early 1990s deciding to create a subway line under Eglinton Avenue, right near our station here. And when Mike Harris came into power in 1995, he canceled it. In part, he said we couldn't afford it, but I've always been suspicious about that. I always felt, as you talk about transit maps overlapping with political maps, do you know whose riding that Eglinton line was going to end up in on the West End?
Would that Bob
Rae's. There you go. So that might have had something to do with it as well. Anyway, is that it for us?
I believe so. We
I
hit our
think that's
three
it for
notes.
us. That is the On Poly podcast for this February 16th, 2024.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And if you already follow our show, help a friend follow it too. You can also see our podcast conversation on television every Friday night at 8 and 11 Eastern as the first half of the agenda. And it's also available on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Make sure you include your first and last name and where you're located, because we'd love to give you credit.
This week's episode was produced and edited by Matthew O'Mara and Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell, Christine Gardner, Ariana Longley, Vito Tagarelli, Jeff Kucera, and Jennifer DeRosa. Managing editor is Katie O'Connor. Lori Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content. Special thanks to our wonderful studio crew for making our first podcast episode happen. Thanks, guys. This was really terrific. Until next Friday, everybody. Bye-bye.
See you soon.